Buonasera al pubblico, buonasera ambasciatore. Diamo inizio a questa conferenza di nuovo in compagnia appunto del rappresentante della nazione messicana, a cui siamo particolarmente debitori per il supporto di questa rassegna, in particolare di questa conferenza. Una conferenza ancora una volta particolarmente importante dal punto di vista del rilievo dell'autorevolezza del relatore. James Oles insegna a Boston ed è uno dei più grandi, più importanti docenti che attualmente compiono uno studio, come dire, complesso, trasversale, come dire, su una ampia area cronologica dedicata all'arte e alla cultura messicana. Si è occupato di moltissimi temi relativi appunto alla storia dell'arte e alla storia dell'architettura messicana, e particolarmente vi segnalo, anche perché è un libro facilmente accessibile anche nelle librerie italiane, quest'opera di riferimento molto recente che si chiama Arte e Architettura in Messico, e copre 5 secoli di approccio messicano alle arti visuali in particolare, e il metodo di indagine del professor Oles è un metodo particolarmente ampio, prendendo in esame tutti i tipi di tecniche, tutti i tipi di arti, tutti i tipi di avvicinamento a questo modo di interpretare la vita e il mondo. È un onore e un piacere ospitarlo qui. Il professore è autore di un doppio saggio, di 2 piccoli saggi in catalogo che io vi suggerirei di rileggere a posteriori dopo questa conferenza. Sono particolarmente interessanti a mio parere, ma ha dedicato questa conferenza, che è una conferenza di nuovo abbastanza di ampio raggio, a un tema molto significativo, anche in rapporto forse a quello che abbiamo affrontato nelle ultime conferenze, nell'ultima in particolare, e cioè l'inserimento dell'opera di Frida Kahlo, che noi conosciamo attraverso questa mostra retrospettiva, all'interno di un discorso decisamente più ampio. In particolare, come vedete dal titolo, è l'essenza di quello che per noi è l'arte di Frida Kahlo, cioè questo rapporto dello spettatore col suo sguardo diretto, e quindi non solo il tema dell'autoritratto, ma il tema dell'autoritratto che guarda lo spettatore, visto non soltanto come un fenomeno che nasce dal nulla, ma come qualche cosa che è rispondente, se non debitore, di una tradizione e di un sistema di arte esistente che non dobbiamo ignorare, dobbiamo imparare a conoscere. Quindi di nuovo, ancora una volta, Frida Kahlo è inserita in un discorso culturale più ampio. Io credo che davvero questo è quello che abbiamo voluto, su cui abbiamo voluto mettere l'accento per queste conferenze, per contestualizzare il più possibile questa artista che è sempre considerata avulsa dalla realtà all'interno di un quadro storico, geografico, culturale, per quanto ampio, però molto preciso. Lascio subito la parola al professor Oles, che ringrazio per questo lungo viaggio che ha fatto per venire fino a qui.
Grazie, Matteo. Yeah, grazie, Matteo. I apologize. 2 days ago, I had a conference written out in English, and in the Mexican embassy they forced me to speak in Spanish, which I could do, but I know no Italian. So we will start. In the 30 years since Hayden Herrera's groundbreaking biography of Frida Kahlo, a seemingly endless bibliography of books, exhibitions, catalogs, and articles has been generated on her work, sometimes focusing on her personal life, and more recently, but more rarely, placing her work within a broader art historical context. The present exhibition here in Rome, in which the works by Frida Kahlo are juxtaposed with paintings by artists like Otto Dix and Giorgio de Chirico, is a notable exception, and I think perhaps defines a future path for Kahlo scholars. Tonight, I want to look once again at the most famous aspect of her career as an artist, self-portraiture, but through the lens of history. I want to place Kahlo's self-portraits in the broader context of the history of Mexican art, from the first autonomous self-portrait done in Mexico, created in the 18th century, to examples of modern and contemporary art. Through these comparisons across time, we can understand better Kahlo's particular obsessions and innovations and her debts to one of the richest artistic traditions in the Americas, but also clarify some aspects of her impact on later artists, especially those modern and contemporary artists who themselves seemed obsessed with self-portraiture, including Kahlo's own father. I also hope that today's lecture provides a sense of the diversity of Mexican painting over time, a sort of mini-survey. And if you want the whole survey, you can get my book that Mateo mentioned, focusing on just one genre, self-portraiture. But more importantly, my goal is not really to figure out Frida Kahlo's sources but rather to think that through comparing her work, through these comparisons, we may better understand her own choices, and Kahlo, at the same time, can help force us to revisit other works with new eyes. So she can help us understand paintings, even if there's no direct connection between her and those artists. I might start by mentioning that portraiture did exist as a form of representation in pre-Columbian art, especially among the Maya, such as in the famous plaster bust of the king of Palenque, Pacal, that you see on the right, on the left, found in his burial chamber. But also, to a lesser extent, we find portraiture among the Aztec, and on the right side is a very rare relief of Moctezuma II in Chapultepec Park in Mexico City. On the top is what you see today. On the bottom is a drawing because it was vandalized by the Spanish right after the conquest. So there was portraiture. And also, epigraphers have found evidence on Maya monuments of signatures, of artists' signatures. So there was an identity of the artist as someone whose name was worthy of commemoration. But self-portraiture, as far as we can tell, was apparently absent, perhaps because self-portraiture presupposes a concept of art as the individual and creative result of genius rather than a profession in the service of political and divine forces. It took quite a while for the sense of authority and independence, already evident in the Italian Renaissance, where self-portraits become frequent, to appear in the painting workshops of viceregal Mexico. Immediately after the Spanish conquest of the 1520s, the earliest artists were immigrants who had trained in Europe, mainly in Spain. But Mexico City soon developed prosperous and ever larger workshops regulated by the same guild system that ruled in European art capitals. Some scholars have discovered what they believe are self-portraits in subsidiary figures in the compositions of altarpieces and other large multi-figured images. These suppositions, however, these identifications of self-portraits in these big paintings, are not ever based on documents, like letters or period descriptions, or even on other portraits of those artists. The basis of identification lies not in the face, but on pure speculation, because the faces that look out at us are thought to have some presence when they stare out at the viewer. And those of you who are familiar with the Italian mannerism, I'm sure many are, know that in Pontormo's famous deposition in Santa Felicità in Florence, there's supposedly a self-portrait of Pontormo looking out at the viewer. So this was also probably common in paintings in Mexico, but we have no specific documentation. The first independent self-portrait that we can be sure of in the history of Mexican art is the image here on the left of a painter named Juan Rodriguez Juarez from about 1719. So this is the first documented self-portrait in the history of Mexican art. The work clearly shows an artist with a brush in his very sketchily painted hand. The work, the strong diagonal to the left, which I think you can see barely, may be the easel or canvas in his studio. The work is apparently unfinished, but it is too large. It measures 66 by 54 centimeters, so it's too large to be just a sketch for this image. This is a similar face. It's the same man's face that appears in the Adoration of the Kings, the central panel of the main altarpiece, the Altar de los Reyes, in the Mexico City Cathedral. Painters like Rodriguez Juarez, who was indeed the star artist of his day, worked on commission. The French fashion that he wears reveals he had already absorbed, however, some of the more progressive ideas that began to permeate the Spanish colonial world after 1700 due to the presence of the French Bourbons upon the throne of Spain. And maybe this French idea emboldened him to leave the subtle confines of the altarpiece, to shift from being a humble observer of the Holy Family, which he is here, it's just part of a religious scene, to become a kind of a self-portrait, an individual assertion of his genius. This was painted also just at the time when Mexican artists in these workshops were first beginning to question the guild system and call for a redefinition of their self as a professor. They called themselves professors, like those associated with literature or history, rather than masters, which was a term associated with craft and trades. Oh, there he is. A little more detail. So when Kahlo shows herself painting at an easel in 1951, she is engaging with a long iconographic tradition that goes back to the first self-portrait in her own country, but a tradition that was also common in Europe. And although she might not have been familiar with the altarpiece, with the image of Rodriguez Juarez in the altarpiece, she would have known this painting very well because it appeared on the cover of the first publication devoted to Mexican self-portraits, a 1947 exhibition catalog. There are few other secure self-portraits in colonial Mexican art, painted, say, before the 1821 independence, though some landscape painters include themselves in the composition. They're at the easel, seen from a great distance. Those aren't really self-portraits. It's just the artist appearing within a landscape. But this would change in the 19th century. Among the numerous reforms initiated by the Bourbons in New Spain at the end of the colonial period, reforms that were primarily intended to modernize the economy and strengthen the royal control from Madrid, was the creation of an art school, the Royal Academy of San Carlos, founded in Mexico City in 1785, which was intended in part to create images supporting the monarchy, as well as to promote the creation of luxury objects in the new French style, what was then known as buen gusto, or good taste, and which we would eventually call neoclassicism. Originally from the city of Puebla, José Luis Rodríguez Alconedo, who you see here on the left, was best known as a silversmith, but he was also a member of the Academy. He was an academician of honor, and he taught engraving or printmaking there. He also created official works for the viceregal regime, like this silver portrait of Charles IV. But with his brother, got caught up with the fervor of the independence movement, became a rebel, was exiled to Spain, and when he returned to Mexico, was captured by the Spanish and executed by the Royalist army. The self-portrait of 1810, done in pastels, was actually finished in Spain, probably right after he was sort of exiled there. And that it survived, I think, from this very tumultuous period is surprising. On the bust, which asserts his neoclassical identity, it says "se souvenir," or in remembrance, which might indicate a melancholic turn home, a melancholic idea of his home that he's left, or perhaps the memory of a woman he left behind. In the self-portrait, Rodriguez Alconedo shows his neoclassical credentials in the marble or plaster bust that he is about to crown. Although he turns away from the viewer, his self-presentation is informal, not unlike contemporaneous portraits by Rafael Gimeno y Planes, a Valencian who had come to Mexico as professor of painting in the academy and who probably influenced Rodriguez Alconedo. Kahlo's inclusion of pre-Columbian sculptures, as in this 1945 painting, echoes that use of the neoclassical sculpture in Alconedo's work. In the Rodriguez Alconedo, one possible interpretation is that he is the sculptor, which is not the case in the painting by Kahlo. Nevertheless, while the kneeling ceramic figurine from Colima, there in the background, here, obviously, she's not holding it. It is connected to her by yellow ribbons, along with a spider monkey from the tropical south and the Xolo Escuintle, or Mexican hairless dog, in the front. So she's connecting herself to this sculpture, but of a very different tradition than the neoclassical one, obviously. Of the painters who emerged in the country after Mexico attained independence in 1821, Frida Kahlo is most often, even indelibly and inevitably, connected to Ermenilo Bustos, and I apologize for the mistake, there's no D in his name. Ermenilo Bustos, a provincial artist who worked in and around the town of Purísima del Rincón, Guanajuato. Making a living from painting alone was apparently difficult. Bustos had an eclectic career. Besides being a painter, he was a farmer, carpenter, church sacristan, and also an ice cream maker. His assured self-portrait of 1891, however, which is an anomaly in 19th century practice by artists from the provinces, from outside of Mexico City, belies this modest rejection of professional status. He called himself an amateur, but clearly in this portrait, he was showing himself the equal of any academic painter. The oval frame may have also been influenced by photography. The position of the head, the unemotional stare, even the prominent eyebrows, all seem to connect these two portraits from across half a century. And it is particularly uncanny to think that Bustos died in the same year that Frida Kahlo was born. The Casa Azul, her house museum, today in Mexico, preserves similar 19th century portraits, mostly by unknown artists who directly inspired her. They seemed more direct and honest, supposedly unmediated by academic training, although Bustos may have had some professional training. He signed his works always aficionado, amateur, to assert his independence from the academic system. Could Kahlo have known this work? Well, she certainly would have known it by 1947. It appeared in that book that I mentioned. But even in these earlier paintings, like the one you see here from the 1930s, she might have been thinking of Bustos. The painting had already entered into the collection of one of the of a Mexican artist in Guadalajara. So I'm going to just skip here because I know the translator is reading, but I'm going to just move forward. Bustos worked on the margins in the provinces, but he was a principal inspiration for nationalist painters like Kahlo. Like Diego Rivera, she rejected the more official images of the 19th century, including history paintings produced in the Academy of San Carlos, like this one, as too European. One of the earliest, however, by Juan Cordero, this painting of 1850 was done here in Rome at the Accademia di San Luca. While the artist was on a government pension to study here in Rome. In the middle of the 19th century, the very conservative and very Catholic professors in Mexico encouraged their students to go to Rome rather than Paris. The first of these grandes machines, as the French call them, linked Mexican history to Spain, and particularly to Columbus and the court of Ferdinand and Isabella. For many intellectuals, in fact, national history began with Columbus, even if he never touched foot on Mexican soil. As required by his fellowship, Cordero had to send a canvas back to Mexico as proof of his accomplishments, and he sent this painting, which is a very large painting, called Columbus Before the Catholic Kings, and that's Columbus in black. His mastery of the academic discipline that he learned here in Rome was evident in every detail, and this painting impressed critics not only in Mexico City but in Rome because his angle, his idea, the great adventurer financed by the Catholic kings brings God to the New World, appealed to conservatives and romantics. For elites back home in Mexico, this painting confirmed European cultural hegemony historically as well as aesthetically. Unlike most contemporary images of the same scene, however, Cordero showed Columbus, the explorer, presenting 3 Indians at court, along with gifts brought from the Caribbean. And on one level, this parallels Cordero's own painting, which he had to give as a gift to the Academy. And here, obviously, are the Indians, which appear in the detail. The kneeling figure in the lower left, the kneeling figure in profile, has been interpreted as a self-portrait of Cordero. And this is Cordero, and that's the Indian there. Whether or not this is true, the Indians in the painting do display American humility to European authority in the painting, and that's what Cordero was doing himself. He was showing, as an American, he was a humble student of European neoclassicism and the traditions, basically, of the Accademia here in Rome. What is fascinating to me is that this may be the first example of an elite or mainstream Mexican artist dressing up like an Indian as a form of asserting a national or American identity. Although Kahlo, who did the same thing, as you see here in this photograph, was far less deferential to European authority. Her cross-cultural dressing is a sign of assertive resistance. The embroidered huipils, the folk jewelry, her hair braided up a la Indienne, captured the attention of jaded audiences in New York and Paris, but were also graphic statements of resistance to the fashion and style of the bourgeoisie. Women were actually not allowed to study in the Academy of San Carlos until 1888. But they did take night classes with academicians and could exhibit their work at the annual or biannual salons, provided that they did not offer it for sale. Most of the work of the so-called women painters, las señoritas pintoras, was rather private, intended for the family and close friends, as some of Frida Kahlo's work, like the Henry Ford Hospital, which is in the exhibition, was as well. But Guadalupe Carpio, who painted this image, was probably enabled to study because her father was a poet and a doctor and was a professor of anatomy in the Academy, as well as a member of the board, and this probably explained her access to art. This is one of the few self-portraits done by any woman in the 19th century. She sits in a chair, accompanied by her mother and her children. but she's painting a portrait of her husband. He's not present, but her only present as a painting, and this painting of her husband actually exists. It's actually a portrait that she did. So here you get a sense that for the woman artist, even as a self-portrait, the family is the principal spectator, the principal audience. As Angelica Velasquez, a Mexican art historian, has written, Guadalupe Carpio here shows herself as an artist, but also asserts her maternal duties, and with the father looking over the whole scene, even if he's not there. And this made me think of how Frida Kahlo very often includes portraits of Diego Rivera, of her husband, in paintings, like Diego on My Mind of 1943, where he too can be seen as sort of overlooking the scene. At the turn of the 20th century, simultaneous international movements like Art Nouveau in France and what I think you call Stile Floreale or Liberty here in Italy emerged as a form of rejection of bourgeois norms, of grand nationalist discourse, of modern technocratic regimes, and of industrial and urban development. In Mexico and Spain and Latin America more generally, this was known as Modernismo. Several Mexican artists embraced symbolism as part of their own liberation from academic rules, though they were initially more adventuresome in iconography than in style. Such is the case with Julio Ruelas, an artist who had trained in Karlsruhe before returning to Mexico. And to the translator, I am going to read this sentence. Sorry. In the early 1900s, he was the chief illustrator of the Revista Moderna, which you see there on the left. And I'm fascinated by this page from the magazine where he has his self-portrait because you get up above that femme fatale in bondage, and it's like she's being raped by a serpent. Very strange up there in the masthead. The self-portrait on the right, however, is Ruelas' most famous single image, perhaps made after his return to Germany. Criticism. The image is called Criticism. Criticism is a torturous demon, a sexually ambiguous homunculus with the ears of a jackass and the wounding bite of the mosquito, emitting noxious rays. Is there a comparison to be made here? If the insects in Frida Kahlo's 1940s self-portrait seem more related to an overly fertile nature, a world of delicacy and flight, the crown of thorns necklace speaks of another form of torture. If always associated with the personal, could these images of suffering also reveal the discomfort of life as an artist, caught between an audience that pays no attention, the monkey, and one that is constantly threatening to attack, like critics, the black cat? Another modernista, less radical than Ruelas, whose work might have been familiar to Kahlo, he was a teacher of Diego Rivera, was Herman Hedóvias. This is a self-portrait a la Rembrandt from 1893. So this idea of dressing up that Kahlo did a lot isn't surprising. Compare it, as we could compare here, to a self-portrait dedicated to Leon Trotsky. We find a similar use of the Baroque presentation with curtains, the same use of an archaic costume, a costume from the past. In all of these prior works, I'm not so much proposing documented sources, but my role here is to be a little bit more of a provocateur, hoping that such comparisons, like those that are made in the show between Kahlo and European artists, can make us think harder about her work and look closer. I've looked back in time to explore how historic works may have inspired Kahlo, or how we can understand the past and Kahlo through that lens. In planning this lecture, I realized that when we get to the 20th century, to Kahlo's contemporaries in the fervent artistic milieu that emerged in Mexico City after the Revolution of 1910-1920, There were just too many artists creating too many self-portraits to begin to even attempt a survey. I only have an hour. Some, like Manuel Rodriguez Lozano, here on the left, whose very bold, fauvist portrait, it's called Yo, I. Maybe thinking of Picasso, also did a very famous self-portrait called Yo, Picasso. This is 1924. This probably certainly influenced Kahlo's early work. But on the right side is a painting by another woman artist named Maria Izquierdo, a landscape with a self-portrait of the artist in the window holding her own decapitated head, which is at once confessional and very metaphysical. And by the way, this painting is an obvious homage to de Chirico, who is of tremendous interest to Mexican artists in the 1940s. This is probably Maria Izquierdo's painting is influenced by Kahlo. She's trying to do her own version of a Kahlo painting in her own language. Kahlo, in fact, had a profound impact on many Mexican artists, not so much in her style as in this new sense of self. Her works also sold very well in the 1930s and into the 1940s. Very well. There was a waiting list for paintings by Kahlo, and I think this inspired other Mexican artists to try to do some self-portraits, maybe. And so in 1947, the Mexican government did a whole show, mainly of the self-portraits of these 20th century artists. They had been doing so many things. Now, instead of surveying all of these artists, of her contemporaries, I want to look at two who were, like Frida Kahlo, obsessive about self-portraits, meaning they return to the representation of their self again and again and again. And one of them was Diego Rivera. This is a selection of only 8 of the several self-portraits that he did, ranging in date from one done during his first trip to Europe in 1907 in Madrid, in the upper left, all the way down to a very sad painting of, as an old man, he wasn't so old, but old enough, painted just 3 years before his death. Only one of these is a mural, the one from 1923, 1924, but he inserted his own face into several of his mural paintings as well. There are others, and I think that most of the later ones from 1941 on are actually indebted, even in their compositions, to Kahlo. And particularly if you look at the ones here, these along the bottom, the way that we get the face in the foreground and then some interesting things going on in the background, like a market scene or landscape elements that relate to the way Kahlo, too, often created these very artificial backgrounds for her paintings, like leaves or animals or things like that. So I think here Rivera is probably copying or following Kahlo. Though Rivera usually shows himself as a little bit more disheveled, a little bit more frumpy, not so elegant. Kahlo often showed herself as much more elegant. There's somebody else, though, that I think influenced Frida Kahlo. Even before she married Diego Rivera, there was an artist that she knew very well that was also obsessed with self-portraiture, and that was her father. Photographs and documents uncovered in the vast archive after sealed rooms in the Casa Azul were opened in 2004 included hundreds of photographs, and while it remains unclear to what extent this abundance of new information will deeply change our view of Kahlo, there was one group of images that made me rethink her work, and especially her self-portraits, for they too speak of this same self-obsession. And even the idea of presenting yourself naked, as Kahlo's father did, you can see. art historians had known one or two self-portraits by Guillermo Kahlo, who was born in Baden-Baden and who immigrated to Mexico in 1890. But almost from the beginning of the time he began working as a photographer, at the end of the 1890s, we find him making self-portraits, as many photographers have done. And that image of him with the fez on the top right is probably his first self-portrait. He became mainly known as an architectural photographer, but he had started his career as a portrait photographer. These, however, seem to almost all have been private works, meant for himself and his family, although a few somehow filtered out. So one of these photographs, not maybe this exact one, but one of these photographs inspired Kahlo's posthumous portrait of her father from 1952. But I think all of them, more than works by Diego Rivera or Van Gogh or any other artist, I think she was surrounded by self-portraiture from the time that she was a child. In the remaining time I have, I want to just look at four artists who worked after Frida Kahlo, for whom self-portraiture was a key form of expression. The first of these is José Luis Cuevas. Beginning with his first one-man show in 1953, Cuevas emerged as a magisterial draftsman, focusing on anti-heroic characters drawn from the streets and madhouses or insane asylums, and creating endless self-portraits, often in the company of prostitutes and lovers. And in this you can see here on the left as you can see clearly, it says in English, self-portrait after Rembrandt from 1962. And this is interesting that he's inscribed it in English because Cuevas's principal market was in the United States. He also was echoing Picasso in many of these images as well. Cuevas embraced the human figure at a time when most of his generation were turning towards abstraction. But except for some anti-Franco images and a few references to Kafka and Dostoevsky, most of his images have no reference to any specific time or place. He was a brilliant wit, and he assumed the role in Mexico of the enfant terrible, successfully using the press, which in this period closely followed every artistic debate and scandal, to emerge as the spokesman of his generation. In 1958, Cuevas published an untitled, ironic letter manifesto in a leading newspaper, in which he called for a Mexican art world, and this is what he called for, this is a quote, of broad highways leading out to the rest of the world rather than narrow trails connecting one adobe village with another. Cuevas was really trying to advocate for a Mexican art that would look out to Europe and to the United States. This, more than any other text or event, this essay asserted a rupture with the muralists and with artists like Frida Kahlo, which was more rhetorical than actual. Cuevas had an ego, that's for sure, and by looking at Picasso, perhaps he wanted to take that same path, that creative figure lost in the brothel. And those of you who know the Demoiselle d'Avignon, of course, is a reference to the brothel, and Picasso often showed himself in the company of prostitutes, and that's Cuevas here with some frightening-looking, animalistic prostitutes and other women there around him. I think Cuevas was actually also inspired by Warhol, his contemporary, not in the style, of course. The style was rather archaic for the 1950s and 1960s, but in terms of self-presentation, of searching for fame, and of responding to and manipulating the media. Now, one of the most fascinating Mexican self-portraits, and perhaps one of the most important works of art of the late 1960s, yet almost unknown today, is Cuevas's ephemeral mural, inaugurated before a large crowd in the Zona Rosa in Mexico City in 1967. Just bear with me. Whoops. Okay. I'm going to show you the video now, and I'm going to not talk because I think there's a soundtrack, which is not so important. You're going to see that it's a sort of a happening of 1967. The billboard has an enormous self-portrait of the artist and a gigantic signature. It was supposed to be just up for 1 month. And by this temporary billboard, he was doing a parody of the muralist's egocentrism and desires for permanence, while simultaneously embracing commercial self-promotion as a valid strategy, very much in line with what was happening elsewhere in the 1960s. There were printed T-shirts. Must have been the first time that a Mexican artist had T-shirts made to commemorate himself. And this documentary film, there's other images in the billboard which you can barely see, including a soccer player who symbolized male aggression, a cluster of nuclear war victims that took on a sort of composition that echoed Guernica by Picasso. It is a sort of public mural that critiques the official muralism being promoted by the Mexican government, and it's really about satire. So let's see if we can just...
Jueves 8 de junio de 1967, todo está listo para que José Luis Cuevas descubra su primer mural efímero. Ya a media tarde, horas antes de la inauguración, los habitantes de la llamada Zona Rosa de México se han reunido allí donde se cruzan las calles de Génova y Londres. El público, en su gran mayoría, está compuesto de jóvenes que miran a Cuevas como uno de los suyos. Ven en este acontecimiento un acto generacional y un signo de los tiempos. Al fin se devela el mural cuando ya cae la noche sobre México. Cuevas declara que ha trabajado en un taller de anuncios comerciales y que su obra es una protesta contra los artistas que se toman demasiado en serio y aspiran a la eternidad de sus creaciones. En cambio, este mural fue hecho en una semana para durar un mes en exhibición y luego ser destruido. El mural, que encabeza un autorretrato y la gran firma del autor, fue cambiado. Los acontecimientos del Medio Oriente hicieron que perdiese el humor inicial y se volviera sombrío. Cuevas abre un camino e invita a otros pintores a hacer murales, carteles que, como las historietas, se continúen de uno a otro. Ha sido, en fin, una manifestación irónica que solo un artista de gran talento puede permitirse.
Well, I just wanted to show that also to give a sense of how Mexicans in the 1960s, you look at that crowd and they could be in Rome in 1967, and they are there as spectators because in that part of Mexico City, these young people were really associating themselves with sort of a new, cool, hip attitude towards life that was kind of cynical about the old school, and particularly about the muralists, and particularly about Frida Kahlo, and putting this giant billboard up about the self-representation really was poking fun, I think, of that, of not only of the muralists, but probably of Kahlo's own self-obsession in portraiture. Another group of artists that can be understood within a loosely defined movement known as Neomexicanism consisted of figurative artists, and I'm going to show you just 3 examples, of the 1980s who mined the icons of national culture drawn from both high and low art with even greater irony than Cuevas. They painted cactus, volcanoes, folk art. They used calendar illustrations, images of the Mexican flag, Aztec sculpture, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and very frequently, Frida Kahlo as part of this complex of nationalist imagery. Because by the 1980s, Frida Kahlo was as Mexican, as much a symbol of Mexican identity as the Virgin of Guadalupe or an Aztec. In direct contrast to lyrical and geometric abstraction or activist art, or even in contrast to Cuevas's Happening, much of the art produced between the 1982 economic collapse and the ascendancy of neoliberalism in Mexico in the late 1980s and early 1990s reveals a hermetic turn inward, as if the answers that artists have, the answers were to be found at home in Mexican culture rather than abroad, and in the self rather than in collectives. This phenomenon, as I say, has come to be known as Neomexicanism. This generation was formed in part by a general malaise and cynicism that extended across class lines. The political and economic situation in Mexico limited international travel and exchange for many artists, some of whom were also rebelling against sexual and cultural restrictions, especially on women and gays. This was not a monolithic return to the discourse of the Mexican school of the 1920s and 1930s. It was really much more of a skeptical examination of those collective myths of national identity, part of a broader postmodern critique. And a similar questioning of national myths and history through figuration was taking place, of course, in other places, especially in the New Figuration and Neo-Expressionism in New York, in Berlin, and here in Italy as well. The subtle differences among the different strands of Neo-Mexicanism might be clear through a comparison of 3 self-portraits by Naum Zenil, Julio Galan, and Monica Castillo. All are referencing Frida Kahlo, who by the 1980s had emerged as a cult figure in Mexico and the United States. Her heroic status relied as much on her biography at this time than on her work. Her broken bodies, sexual ambiguity, and conflicted marriage with Diego Rivera resonated with the preoccupations of many of these young artists, especially women and gays. For some, Kahlo provided a crucial professional model as a painter of intimate confessions who challenged the rhetorical strategies of state-funded muralism, but for others, she was a visual force that they had to fight against. In Naum Zenil's precisely rendered self-portraits, he sometimes appears with references to his own biography or with his partner, Gerardo Vilchis. And in this image, of all due respect, this is the artist here, his mother, the artist, his loved boyfriend, and of course he's embracing Kahlo, and this is his family home there in the background. He's asserting his Mexican identity, his racial identity, his sexual identity without any emotion. These works actually seem to reveal a lot, but they also conceal. And many of Naum Zenil's works are specific homages to particular paintings by Kahlo, and with all due respect, was done in the same year that Hayden Herrera published her groundbreaking biography of Frida Kahlo. 1983 is when that book came out in English. He cites directly the 2 Fridas, as well as an earlier painting called The Bus. And then you see Frida in My Heart makes the point even more explicitly. Here's the 2 paintings by Kahlo that Zenil is sort of melding together. the bus, and the two Fridas. So this is this embrace, literally an embrace, a loving embrace of Kahlo as a model. But where Naum Zenil found strength, not only in Mexican culture, but particularly in Kahlo as an ally or a predecessor or a sort of mother figure, Julio Galan, who is from Monterrey, from the north of Mexico, found oppression. In the 1980s, Galan felt very distant from all sorts of stereotypes of Mexican identity, like these Tijuanas and mariachis and, well, you know all the stereotypes of Mexican culture. He was from the north, from Monterrey, which is a city that was trying to create a sort of Houston-like economy far from Mexico City and outside of the historical domination of Mexico City, and particularly outside of the nationalist culture that was centered in Mexico City. So he's really part of this. He was still, however, associated with the Neomexicanists, though he explored much broader themes and created a very eccentric Warholian persona as he moved back and forth between Monterrey and New York City, where he lived much of his time. He actually met Andy Warhol on purpose, as a sort of demonstration of his model was more Warhol, perhaps, than Kahlo. His earliest works refer to his childhood, but many of his paintings embody the most critical, ironic, and pessimistic strain of Neomexicanism. And my favorite of all of these is this painting, I Want to Die, it says, and that paper banner above him, Me quiero morir, I want to die. It's framed, the whole frame around the edge is taken from, these flowers are taken from traditional Mexican folk art. And of course, that paper banner at the top is a typical type of Mexican decoration that perhaps some of you have seen if you go to a Mexican restaurant or maybe a party at the embassy, I don't know. And clearly there's the flag as well. But if we look at the artist, he's deathly pale, exaggerating his European aspect of his background. And he raises his arms sort of in surrender or martyrdom, bound by chains. And you see these chains that run around him. And these chains, and if I had more time, I could explain better, actually echo the boundaries, the geographic boundaries of Mexico. And particularly here, that's like the Yucatan Peninsula, sort of echoing Mexico without displaying it directly. So Mexico's boundaries are his chains, right? He wants to escape that. And the banner, which is usually used in fiestas, laments rather than celebrates his dystopic wish. Death rather than enslavement to Mexican identity. And I would just say that we can see this, just echoing this painting, echoing back as almost a commentary on Frida Kahlo's famous self-portrait on the borderline, where she too has that Mexican flag in her hand. It's actually made of paper. And in Kahlo's painting, she straddles the borderline, but the flag points towards the Mexican side, and the Mexican side is a place of nature and culture, and the American side on the right is a place of industry and death. And she's clearly associating herself with that Mexican side that he's rejecting in his painting, as if he wants to escape to New York. He wants to escape to the industrial world. I would just say that this sense, though, of the suffering that he wants to die, of the pain that is sort of inflicted by being bound up, also resonates with Kahlo, as if he wants to once criticize her, but can't necessarily escape her as a model. And I think even more funny, in a way, are a series of paintings he did in the late 1980s, of himself, really, the same white skin, wearing Mexican dresses, like this costume from Tehuantepec, from the south of Mexico, but where the face is cut out so that this is a hole. And viewers can actually go there, perhaps behind the painting and put your own face into it, which is similar to the way Kahlo's face actually looks as if it's peeking through a cutout hole on the right in the painting from 1943. And what Galan is saying is that these costumes are purely false fictions that are put on and worn and don't have anything to do with the reality of the person that's wearing them, usually, and certainly not in the case of Kahlo, who wore these costumes that had nothing to do with her own background, but as sort of costumes, as statements. Finally, I want to end with a discussion of one artist who, more than many others, engaged specifically and intellectually, not with Frida Kahlo's symbolic elevation as the Mexican painter sine qua non, to be embraced or ironized, but rather with Kahlo's seemingly endless self-representation. And she's specifically trying to get at what Kahlo was doing in these paintings, but critiquing it. The way that scholars in the 1980s were talking about Kahlo was that her paintings were about truth, that they were about exposing her soul to the public. And this was confirmed by Kahlo's own words, which were sometimes taken out of context. For example, a very famous quote was, "I paint what I see." Well, Kahlo did not necessarily paint what she saw in the mirror. Kahlo crafted her own identity, like all artists do. But in the and now I think we have a much better awareness of this, but in the 1980s and 90s, people were less clear about it. And Mónica Castillo, who was born in 1961, studied in Stuttgart and here in Rome, began a series of self-portraits in 1993, now a little bit after Zenil and Galan, and more in line with some ideas of conceptual art that were beginning to become more popular in Mexico, although she was still working as a painter at this time. She later turned to performance and video. Her paintings from the early 1990s can be seen in part as a rejection of the imposition of Kahlo, of the omnipresence of Kahlo as the quintessential woman artist. Castillo used self-portraiture almost as a conceptual system of anti-representation in a series that she called The I is Another, or perhaps This Self that you see is really something else. On the one hand, works like hers used Kahlo's obsessively tight, controlled brushwork, though the face of the artist is always isolated with no costume or symbolic elements to provide context or meaning, as we always see in Kahlo. Her point here was to avoid the fetishization of the artist as an icon, which had happened in the case of Julio Galan. One work, on the left, shows her having peeled off her own skin to show the musculature, which is more, actually, what all women share as humans, that underlying musculature. Another work, on the right, breaks down the face into patches that might recall, in one way, Cézanne or Picasso, but here, each one of the patches depicts some sort of skin disease or problem of the sort that women are supposed to erase. These are represented as having occurred on different dates, which are lightly painted right onto the portrait, and you can see the dates, I think, if you like here. As if these are her different skin problems on different days. And they also remind us, of course, of the giornate of a fresco artist, perhaps, as if she's painted each of these patches in a different day. Kahlo's skin is always eternally perfect, idealized at the same time that the pain is supposedly implied. Kahlo's self-portraits seem to communicate her soul, tell us some message that she's communicating over the decades, but the faces are blank. They're not Kahlo. we're not looking at Frida Kahlo. We're looking at representations of Frida Kahlo, and mask-like ones at that. And Monica Castillo wanted to remind us of that, of the discursive power of the self-portrait, which we want to always read as a direct reflection of the artist in the mirror, as an honest stare back out at us, as a direct communication with us, but that, like all mirror images, is a distortion of the real, of something real, perhaps that was lost long ago. Monica's paintings also remind us of the rich ways that Frida's work can be understood today, not just as an example of Neue Sachlichkeit a la Mexicaine or Mexican surrealism, but simply as part of the history of modern Mexican art and part of an even longer and deeper engagement by Mexican artists with examinations of the self, which makes them, and Kahlo, part of that ever more global art history that we increasingly embrace today. Thank you.